Welcome to today's class on literary criticism. The word criticism comes from the ancient Greek noun krites, Krites. Krites, which means to judge. Now, you might be wondering what is there in literature which has to be judged? Literature, you already know, comprises of works of creative imagination, which include poetry, drama, fiction, non-fiction, and all these works represent culture, tradition, language of the people of a nation. So, literary criticism is a self conscious act of appraising a work of art. And this appraisal is carried out by some individuals like you and me, but maybe they manifest some higher form of wisdom and knowledge and adhere to some kind of rules. Therefore, they analyze these works from various perspectives. So, the historical analysis of any imaginative work or literary work ranges from the classical age of the Greeks to the modern age. So, we are today going to learn about the phases, the growth, and development of literary criticism as it occurred from the age of Plato to the present times. So, Plato, Aristotle, Horace, Longinus, Augustine, Dryden, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Matthew Arnold, T.S. Eliot, Richards, these are a few names and names of all these literary critics who have appraised the work of art and have contributed to the corpus of literary criticism. So, what is literary criticism? Basically, it is a kind of an opinion which is supported by some kind of evidence which might be related to the theme, style, setting, whether it is historical, economic, cultural, or political. So, it is a kind of a discussion on the content of a text. And what evolves is basically an integration and amalgamation of the ideas about the work with the insights that have been gained from the research that was carried out on that particular literary work. So, by now, you know that criticism is not something new. It evolved from the classical times, and it is a way to judge the merit of a work or to appraise, not the merit, but to appraise a literary work. So, when we are judging a piece of literature, we can split that into different questions. And these questions might break into what is the purpose of literary criticism? How broad is the field of inquiry, and what are we supposed to inquire? What are the connections with other disciplines such as philosophy, religion, politics, and does it have any social implications also? So, how does the act of writing impinge upon the social, economic, cultural, and political status of any nation or a society? Above all, we need to inquire what is the significance of our lives and how are our lives influencing the works of literature and how the literature is influencing our lives. So, at the heart of it, there might be a question in your mind that why should we ever bother, to appraise a work, or whether it is poetry, fiction, or drama. But surely, When we have to understand any text, whether it was written in the classical times, the Renaissance times, the neoclassical times, modern times, you have to pose certain questions because there is a physical word which is being imitated by the writers and the authors, and those representations or reflections from reality might not be actually true. Why? Because it has a blend of imagination. So, when we talk about Plato and Aristotle, who are the very pioneers of this literary criticism, their prime concern was to attempt a study of the social value of literature and how to come to terms with reality. So, the poet as a man and poetry as a form of statement both seemed quite untrustworthy to Plato, and he states that in his work, The Republic, where he says it depicted the physical world as an imperfect copy of the transcendent ideas, and poetry is, he says, an imitation, so a copy of a copy. So literature could only, he believed, mislead a seeker of truth who was trying to credit the poet with some kind of a divine inspiration. And because of that divine inspiration, something, what is true was coming out of his mouth. But Plato is quite contrary to all this because he was the one, who said that the poets, because of all this, because they are creating a copy of a copy, and you cannot take their words as an oracle or a divine kind of an inspiration or a prediction. Therefore, he says that poets should be banished from the hypothetical republic that he talks about in this book. Aristotle, in his book Poetics, countered Plato's indictment by stressing that what is normal and useful about the literary art. He talks about the tragic poet. He says the tragic poet is not so much divinely inspired as he is motivated by the universal human need to imitate. And what he imitates is not something like a bed with the help of which Plato gives an example, but it is a noble action. So the imitation, presumably, he says, has a civilizing value for those who empathize with it. He talks about tragedy. You have already read in the previous semester about what a tragedy is and what all does Aristotle talk about in his work, The Poetics. So he says tragedy can definitely arouse emotions of pity and terror in the audience, but the emotions are a form of a purgation, a catharsis. And he succeeds in portraying literature as a very satisfying and regulating the passions instead of inflaming these emotions. So, by now, whatever I have spoken, you probably can come to a kind of a conclusion that Plato and Aristotle are antagonists. So, both, but still, they maintain that poetry is mimetic, imitative, and they treat the arousing of emotion in the perceiver, and both feel that poetry takes this justification from its service to the state. So it was quite obvious that both these men, that poets wielded great power over the modern critics who have tried to show that poetry is more than words and emotions, and Aristotle had to offer a reassurance that it was not socially explosive. So Aristotle has greatly contributed to criticism, and whatever lies in his ethical defense about literature is his inductive treatment of the elements, the kind of poetry, the poetic modes that he talks about, the means of imitation, the action, the manner, and its effects. So these distinctions assist the critic in judging each mode according to its end and regarding the beauty, instead of regarding beauty as a fixed entity. So the ends of the tragedy, as conceived by Aristotle, have to best serve by a very harmonious relationship between these elements, which you already know, you have read in poetics: the plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song. So, Aristotle believes that the insights into the universal aspects of the audience's psychology have proved to be adaptable to the genres which were developed long after this as well. So, besides the Greek, you also have the Romans, who criticized, and Greek and Roman criticism offers no parallel to Aristotle's originality. So much of the ancient criticism from the Roman side that comes to us is from Cicero, Horace, Quintilian in Rome, and was absorbed in the technical rules aspiring the rhetoric writers, right? So they followed certain kind of technical rules, and when they were appraising a work, anything that they found was not following these rules, was criticized. So this particular work, The Art of Poetry by Horace, is an urbane amplification of Aristotle's emphasis on the decorum, because Aristotle also talks about the elements which have to be in harmony. So this work was later taken as a neoclassics in 17th century, and not only for its rules but also for its humor, common sense, and appeal to the educated taste. On the Sublime by the Roman Greek known as Longinus was also quite influential in the 18th century. Horace and Longinus from Rome developed the rhetorical and the effective way, and whatever they were stating, Aristotle's thoughts had, but Longinus is trying to reverse the Aristotelian concept about the regulation of the passions, that the work of art is not regulating the passions. When we come to the Middle Ages, we see that criticism suffered from the loss of all the ancient critical texts that were there. So the ancient gods and the surviving classics were reasserted. Entering into the medieval culture, there were allegories available. So the form of writing changed. So primarily, the criticism was first of all taken for the poetic compositions. But as the volume of writing and the genres of writing increased, the ways in which these works were assessed and appraised also increased. So you know that there are a number of approaches with the help of which all these works are analyzed, evaluated, and judged. So when we talk about something after the Middle Ages, Renaissance criticism was something, which was growing, and it grew directly from the recovery of the classical texts and the translations of Aristotle's Poetics into Latin in the year 1498. So by the year 1549, the Poetics was almost rendered into Italian as well. So the critics looked into the ancient poems, plays, for certain insights into the permanent laws about art, and the most influential Renaissance critic was Lodovico Castelvetero, whose 1570 commentary on Aristotle's Poetics encouraged the writing of tightly structured plays by extending a codification in the form of unity, the dramatic unity, the unity of the plot that was to be followed. So, whether classicism, individualism, or any other thing, simultaneously, classicism and there was some kind of innovations going on, and there was also a purification of the vernacular tongue. And in consonance with all these changes that took place, the criticism also started developing gradually and evolving as we have many other forms to date. So, the ideas of the Italian and the French Renaissance were transmitted to England by Roger Ascham, George Gascon, and Sir Philip Sidney. So, you might have heard about Sidney's defense of poesy, which vigorously argued the poet's superiority to the philosopher and the historian on the grounds that his imagination is changed neither to the lifeless abstractions nor to the dull actualities. So the poet, he writes, doth not only show the way, but giveth so sweet a prospect into the way as will entice any man to enter into it. So, still, these words and the traditional conceptions, as handed over by Sidney, are given much of honor, and his whatever he said, was later to be found in the romantic style of writing. So, the Renaissance time, we started with the old classical times. We talked about Plato, Aristotle, the Renaissance time, the Middle Ages, and how the volume of criticism available during the Renaissance was also regarded as a neoclassical. A new form was emerging in that ancient works, which was considered to be of a great aptitude. But neoclassicism connotes a narrower attitude that is once not literary and social. It is like a worldly wise tempering of enthusiasm and a fondness of proved ways and a gentlemanly sense of propriety and balance. So, the criticism of the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in France, was dominated by these Horatian notions, and there were a number of critics like Pierre Corneille, Nicolas Buller, who urged a strict orthodoxy regarding that the dramatic unities, as spoken of by Aristotle, were required, and these were quite distinct to a honor. So, and to disregard them would be a lapse. So, the poet was not to imagine that his genius is exempted from the established laws of craftsmanship. So, by now, this must be very clear to you that whatever was written or whatever was being appraised was subject to certain laws, certain ways of understanding, certain ways of perceiving some concepts and literary works. So, neoclassicism had a lesser impact in England because of English Puritanism and also the original Christian hostility to the secular art, because English authors were quite close to the plebeian taste, and whereas the French were the court oriented people. And so you have a number of ways in which the rules that were laid were broken by the British writers, including Shakespeare himself, right? So, the severe classicist Ben Jonson could bring himself to deny Shakespeare's greatness, and the theme of Shakespearean genius triumphing over the imperfections is echoed by the major British critics from John Dryden and Pope through Samuel Johnson. So, the science of Newton and the psychology of Locke also worked as subtle changes on the neoclassical themes. Pope's essays on criticism again is a Horatian compendium of maxims, but Pope feels obliged to defend the poetic rules as nature methodized. I hope by now you will be able to talk about and write about how the changes on the critical plane occurred from the classical times to the times of Wordsworth. Thank you very much.